Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Elizabeth Anderson. She is Max Shaye Professor of Public Philosophy, John Dewey Distinguished University Professor, and Arthur F. Thurnau Professor at the University of Michigan. Her latest book, and the book we're talking about today, is Hijacked: How Neoliberalism Turned the Work Ethic Against Workers and How Workers Can Take It Back. So, Dr. Anderson, welcome to the show. It's a big pleasure to have you.
It's great to be here.
So let's start perhaps all the way back at the origins of the work ethic, or at least the work ethic that we're talking here about today. So what are the origins of the Protestant work ethic, and what is it exactly?
So the work ethic was invented by Puritan ministers in England, starting in the late 16th century, but it reached the sort of peak of theory in the 17th century. The Puritans were Calvinists, so they're very stern. They were the killjoys of the Reformation. No pleasure here. So that basically what they said was, because under Calvinism, everyone is predestined by God to be either saved or damned, everyone is desperate to know whether they're saved. And to gain assurance that they are saved, the Puritans said, you can't look into your heart, right, to tell whether you really have faith that Jesus is your savior, because we have such a strong motive to deceive ourselves about the quality of our faith that we can't rely on just what we desperately want to be true. So the only way you can tell is through your behavior. And you have to work like crazy. Well, why would work be a sign of faith? It's because God commands all human beings to work to promote the welfare of our fellow human beings. That is what we're placed here on earth to do. God has given us all these natural resources, the earth itself, to enable us to help our fellow human beings on earth. And conscientiously working very hard and using those natural resources that God gave us to help our fellow human beings. That's why we're here. And to pursue God's commands faithfully is the sign that you really have faith in God, right? So you have to work really hard. You can't waste any resources. You're not allowed to waste time either, right? No idleness here. You're supposed to save up your earnings. You can't just waste them on frivolities and luxuries and things like that. You have to use every penny to promote the real welfare of our fellow human beings and not, frivolous junk.
But do you have any idea how exactly these, let's call it an ideology for the time being. We'll come back to that question later on, but how this ideology developed? Did it have something to do with, for example, the advent of capitalism, because it suited capitalism as a sort of new economic structure? Or was it something about the psychological traits of people who like this kind of ideology, the Calvinists specifically? Or was it just something that was already part of the culture from which Calvinists stemmed? And these are just three hypotheses. It could be something else.
So I agree with Max Weber, who wrote the original scholarly study of the Protestant work ethic. It's called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Mm-hmm. And what Weber said is the Protestant ethic, the work ethic, predates modern capitalism as we know it. In the 17th century, it wasn't yet on the scene. So he reads the Puritans, and I agree with him, as fundamentally theologically oriented. Okay, it's really all about God and God's commands for human beings and hope for salvation and things like that. And what Weber said was, despite the fact that their aims were godly and otherworldly, because it promoted an ethic of disciplined labor, it set the stage for capitalism, modern capitalism as we know it. That is capitalism that's based on highly disciplined, highly organized wage labor and inuring workers to the drudgery of the Industrial Revolution. It kind of set the stage to enable the Industrial Revolution to leap forward. But that didn't happen until the 18th century.
And is there any relationship between the work ethic and utilitarianism? And if so, what would it be?
Absolutely. So the Puritans invented utilitarianism. There's a wonderful Puritan theologian, Richard Baxter, who's still studied today in seminaries, by the way. He formulated the first real statement of what is known today as act utilitarianism. He said, given a choice between promoting a greater or a lesser good, you have a strict duty to promote the greater good. And keep in mind that one of the axioms of the Church of England, which was theologically Calvinist, is that there's no such thing as supererogation of doing anything beyond the call of duty. Right? No, you have to maximize the good, right? And you're slipping. It's sinful to do anything short of that. And you can see some of the same moral rigorism among utilitarians today. If you look at, say, somebody like Peter Singer, even though undoubtedly he's made immense amounts of money on his books and lectures and so forth, but he lives a very frugal life, just as those Calvinists thought he should. And he's dedicated most of his income to charity, which is exactly what Baxter said should be done with all that wealth you're accumulating from all that hard work you're doing.
So perhaps some of these, original work ethicists would be into things like effective altruism if they were alive
Absolutely.
today.
Baxter was already there. And what's remarkable is Baxter actually has a wonderful claim that exactly parallels an argument that Peter Singer, in advocating for altruism, effective altruism, made back at, I can't remember, 1980 something. Singer's analogy was, well, suppose you see a drowning child in a pond. Shouldn't you ruin your business suit and your nice shoes and wade in there to rescue the child from death, even though it's going to cost you your nice clothing? And Baxter essentially said the same thing in his Christian Directory, his comprehensive guide to Christian living, in which he said, you should give up the fancy clothing of your wife and children and not obtain for them anything more than plain clothing, so that you can dedicate that money to save the poor.
Yeah. So, one very interesting thing here is that, of course, today there's at least one general idea, that is that we tend to associate the work ethic with conservatism and the political right mostly. But since we're also going to go through some of the intellectual history, intellectual background here over the course of the last few centuries, is there or has there been a progressive slash left-wing version of the work ethic?
Yes, so that's exactly the key argument of my book, is that, yes, there was a conservative work ethic, and Max Weber characterized it accurately. It's nose to the grindstone for the workers to the maximum profit of the capitalist. That's the regime we're living under now. We call it neoliberalism, but it's basically just the modern work ethic. But the key discovery I've made is that Weber was only half right. that if you go back to the Puritans, you can actually see traces of a much more progressive and uplifting story about workers. The point of the work ethic on earth, not just to help our fellow human beings, but also to exalt the status of workers. They're doing God's work. In other words, what Puritans are saying is it's not just the preachers or the priests who are doing God's work. Every worker is doing God's work. And so they have to be honored on that account. And what does that honoring amount to? Well, you have to pay fair and living wages. Workers are entitled to a free choice of occupation. You can't just force them to work at something you want them to do. So they have a certain amount of autonomy. You're not allowed to just boss them around tyrannically. Mm-hmm. You have to treat your employees with love and care and concern, provide safe working conditions. And it's that, what I call the progressive or pro-worker work ethic, that got developed through the 18th century among the political economists, competing with or arguing with the conservative political economists who had this very harsh view that they wanted to impose on ordinary workers. And so I read the history of classical political economy from Locke and Smith on, right through Marx and Edward Bernstein, an unknown hero, social democracy. That whole history I read as an argument between the conservative and the progressive work ethic advocates. And once you read the texts in light of the work ethic, it all falls into place and makes sense.
Okay, so going a few centuries back, one of the most prominent figures whose work you explore in the book is John Locke. So what does John Locke have to do with the work ethic? I mean, what did he have to say about it?
Yeah, so keep in mind that Locke is writing only a couple of decades after the end of the English Civil War. Mm-hmm. And Richard Baxter actually marched with the parliamentary army against the king. He was a chaplain to the army. Okay, so we know whose side he was on. And Locke basically, famously, advanced a labor theory of property. Mm-hmm. So in the state of nature, the only way to get a just claim to property is to work it, right? You have to be growing something on it, making it productive. It's a very Calvinist idea, right? And then you get to own that property in virtue of the fact that you're basically enacting God's will and helping your fellow human beings by making the earth productive. Be fruitful and multiply, right? That's God's command. And he advanced this ethic, I argue, to justify the constitutional claims of the levelers, who advanced a very radical constitutional agenda during the English Civil War. They wanted to abolish the privileges of the lords, abolish the House of Lords, put everyone on common law. So keep in mind, when we talk about common law today, we assume that everybody is subject to common law. But back in those days, the lords had their own set of laws that they passed in the House of Lords that were just for themselves. Right. And they could not be tried by commoners. They were tried by peers. Peers, of course, were fellow members of the House of Lords. Right. And so they had all these privileges, and commoners couldn't sue them. They were totally unaccountable. Like, you couldn't trust a contract between a lord and yourself if you were a commoner, because the lord could just take whatever you made, like a tailor might make some fine dresses and suits and so forth, and then not pay you. And the tailor would be out all of that money and couldn't sue the lord. Right. So the levelers, and then Locke argued for equality under the law. Very important. You don't have different classes of people where one has special privileges over the other. And also for the primacy of Parliament, right? Parliament makes the laws, not the king. And the king can't even veto those laws, right? And so Locke's constitutional proposals are the levelers. So the levelers were explicitly arguing on behalf of the common, ordinary worker against the lords who were oppressing them. And of course, the king who was taxing them and doing other awful things.
And one of the things you explore in the book is the initial intellectual developments that led to conservatives hijacking the concept of the work ethic and turning it against the workers. And of course, we don't have, of course, time to go through every single one of these figures, like, for example, Priestley, Malthus, Burke, and others. But could you tell us perhaps in a summarized way what these intellectual developments were and how exactly did they turn the work ethic against the workers?
Yes. So just keep in mind that what happens during the Industrial Revolution is a split between what I call a conservative work ethic, which is basically the property owners or the capitalist work ethic, and the progressive work ethic, which is a work ethic advanced by and on behalf of workers. Now, if you look at the original work ethic, what it does is it unites the rights and the duties of workers. Workers have to work really hard, but then they're entitled to reap the fruits of their labor, right? You get the benefits for performing the duties here on earth, not just waiting to the next life. But during the Industrial Revolution, and the way the Puritans could make that unity possible is that their model workers were manual workers who also had property claims. The yeoman farmer either owned his own plot of land or had a very long lease on it. The merchant owned his own shop, but was also manually crafting manufactured items like shoes and so forth. So the rights and duties were naturally unified in the 17th century in the typical or model Puritan worker. But by the Industrial Revolution, you see a radical split where workers become wage laborers with no property at all, or no claims on property income, on capital income. Because the machines are too big and expensive for them to own. Capitalists own those things. The factories and so forth, right? The workers are impoverished. And similar things happened in agriculture too, which is very important. The workers lost access to land. They could no longer lease or own land. The big landlords basically gobbled it all up, often by force of parliament, just forced sales. So the workers are impoverished now and have only their wages to rely on in order to survive. So, and so you have to, because the work ethic is the dominant conceptual scheme, and normative scheme in England at the time, everybody had to fit their preferred mode of social organization within the terms of the work ethic, because that was just the dominant ideology. So although the workers' work ethic, I think, has a natural unity to it, where the rights and duties go hand in hand, the capitalists had to explain how they get all the benefits of the work ethic, right? The workers get all the duties, right? And so the way they did this to move quite quickly through, the basic theory was of the conservatives that poor workers would not willingly work hard, except if they were forced to under conditions of poverty and precarity. Okay, and so to make them do their duty to work hard, right, you have to stick them in those positions, but also perhaps to give them some promise that if they do work hard and save and practice these other work ethic virtues, then maybe they can become rich. At least they'll have a shot at that. So, and what that means then, the key problem for the conservatives is that there was a poor law in England. It's basically a national run welfare system under which the deeply impoverished could claim some handouts from the government, typically in cash, that they could use to survive. And of course, that comes right from the effective altruism part of the Puritans. Only they thought it was a strict duty to give, so you can tax people to do it. It's not voluntary, right? You have to be an effective altruist, so it's okay to tax you to do that. So, but they hated the poor law because they imagined, it turns out falsely, that it gave an outlet for lazy idlers to live off the public fisc rather than working hard. Okay, now this is completely false, but that's what they imagined. And so we have a variety of schemes then to somehow eliminate or radically change the work ethic to make sure that lazy people can't just live off our hard-earned tax dollars, okay? So Priestley's idea is you abolish the poor law and you enroll workers in a forced savings plan where they have to save for any possible accidents in their retirement out of their own wages, okay? Bentham thought, well, we can't have people just get cash without having to work in return. And we can't leave them at their liberty because, you know, if they're poor, they're probably doing shady things. So we have to put them all in a panopticon, a prison panopticon, and force them to work in return for their food and, you know, room, board, dress, and so forth, under humiliating and totalitarian conditions. Malthus thought, let's gradually phase out the poor laws. You announce it in advance so people have plenty of time to prepare. Right. And then, you know, then that will force people to be prudent, to save, to delay childbearing until they can afford it, to delay marriage until they can afford children, and so forth. Right. And then we won't need the poor law anymore because it will force people to be prudent and adopt the work ethic virtues. You know, working hard, saving, prudence, looking ahead, not having, you know, more kids than you can afford, and so forth. Paley is arguing against envy of the better off. He says, look, you workers, you think you have it so hard. But in reality, it's the lords who have life really hard because they're wringing their hands all the time on how they can find adequate positions for their second, third, and fourth born sons. Under the laws of inheritance at the time, the firstborn son would inherit everything. And so the fathers then had, right, this desperate scramble to find positions that were, you know, had enough dignity to them for the lower born sons, the later born sons, so that they wouldn't fall into catastrophe. And then Burke and Whately, Burke advanced the idea that workers are entitled to nothing more than exactly what the market gives them. Okay, so if they starve under the market level wage, well, that's too bad, right? There shouldn't be any poor law to supplement that, right? So Burke here and Malthus are very close together. And Whately invented European imperialism, the ideology of European imperialism on biblical grounds. So he was a theologian, and Whately believed that God had already given the gifts of agriculture to human beings after their expulsion from the Garden of Eden. And so if you come across a people who are backward and don't even have, you know, agriculture and herding and working advanced metallurgy and this kind of stuff, then it must have been that they've slipped back due to their idleness. And consequently, it's the burden of the civilized, the most civilized, that is the Europeans, to lift them up by ruling over them, right? And that's really right. The white man's burden is coming straight out of Whately.
Another burden, by the way.
I'm sorry?
Another burden, because earlier, for example, you mentioned the fact that the capitalists, the business owners and all of that, the factory owners have that burden of trying to distribute things through among their second, third, and fourth son and whatever.
Exactly.
Okay, so perhaps there's many things there that, interestingly enough, ring a lot of different bells, because they start to sound very curiously close to neoliberalism. But
absolutely,
we'll get there. Okay, so there are two other specific, I guess, tenets, I guess we could call them, of the work ethic, and more specifically the conservative work ethic, that I would like to ask you about. And the progressive version of it, we're going to get into it in just a bit. But what about independence and personal responsibility? I mean, when exactly were those two aspects of the work ethic introduced, and what role do they play there exactly?
Yes, so independence and personal responsibility are terms that are introduced in the late 18th century with the rise of the conservative work ethic. And independence basically means not receiving means-tested welfare benefits from the state. That's all it means. Because, of course, it can't mean, for the conservatives, getting money that you haven't earned by working for it, since they're all recipients of capital income. And indeed, the inventor of this idea of independence, Priestley, conceded that the rich, by which he meant the landlords and other recipients of passive capital income, are dependent on their own standard of living. Matter of stigmatizing receipt of means-tested welfare benefits. The idea of personal responsibility, I think, is ambiguous because it means two things. One thing that it means is you have to bear the costs and benefits of the consequences of your own conduct, where those costs and benefits are determined by the market. And so responsibility in this sense is just who's going to bear the costs. But then there's another sense of personal responsibility, which is the assumption that if you are bearing a lot of costs, like you are very poor, it must be because you were in some sense irresponsible, not prudent, not obeying the dictates of the work ethic, not working hard enough, having too many kids before you're able to afford to raise them, things like that. And so that notion of personal responsibility as the opposite of irresponsibility is a way to blame the poor for their misfortunes.
So before we get into the progressive version of the work ethic and some of the biggest names associated with it, let's talk here a little bit about some of the political applications that the conservative work ethic first had. So, for example, in the book, you go through things like the English welfare reform, the Irish poor law, the Irish famine policy. Could you tell us a little bit about that? I mean, in what ways did the conservative work ethic, from that was, I guess, originally a philosophy, in what ways did it translate into actual policy?
What I argue is that a prime implication of the conservative work ethic is an extreme skepticism and very stinting attitude towards public welfare benefits for the poor.
Mhm.
That the poor are just trying to be lazy and lie in a hammock while they consume taxpayer funding. There's a punitive attitude towards anyone who falls into a condition of neediness. And that leads to an inclination for some kind of imprisonment of the poor and subjection to forced labor. So you have the invention of the workhouse, which already, it sort of existed in the 17th century, but not, they were considered houses of correction, and they were temporary lodgings where somebody who was, say, begging on the streets without a permit might be sent to be whipped and then, sent on their way. But workhouses in the 18th century become a serious matter, where you could even be consigned for life once you were destitute. And they were designed to be incredibly punitive and harsh. And in the late 18th century, the welfare rolls are increasing, and they continue to increase in the early 19th century. Malthusian panic erupts. There's this idea that the poor are just breeding like rabbits and they're going to overwhelm everyone and just ask for, more and more and eat up all the rents. That was the great worry, that the landlords, because taxation to support the poor law was on land, right? It would be the landowners who ultimately bore that cost. And they were worried that all the rents would just be eaten up with welfare tax payments. So they became very punitive as a means of deterring the poor from even applying for benefits and punishing them if they were allowed. And so the workhouses were basically prisons. People lost all civil rights. They were subjected to more demeaning conditions even than criminals. So, for instance, criminals would get a spoon, right? But the people in the poorhouses had to eat with their hands.
Oh my God.
Deliberately humiliating, right? And that's a deterrence. And it's also a test of whether they're really needy, because no one would ever accept these conditions if they could have any other way of scrounging a living. So in 1832 in England, Parliament passes a welfare reform in which they declare that everyone who claims aid has to enter a workhouse as a condition of getting it. This was never realistic because workhouses were way more expensive than just giving cash handouts to people who stayed in their cottages. And of course, there was always outrage at the extreme cruelty of the workhouses. So they were very unpopular. And so welfare policy gyrates between the hyper punitive and the lower cost, because the landlords also didn't want to pay higher taxes.
Oh my
You
God.
never really had a stable regime. They keep on going back and forth on that.
Yeah.
And then in Ireland, the situation was somewhat different, because there, the conservative work ethic people in Parliament thought that the Irish landlords, as well as the Irish peasants, were exceptionally lazy, lacked industriousness. They lacked frugality. They would just be spendthrifts and waste all their rents on high living. These were stereotypes. And the English thought that they had perfected modern agriculture by adopting a capitalist system of agriculture. And so their project for welfare reform in Ireland was basically to force the landlords to bear the costs of welfare for the poor, in order to force them to get more efficient and productive on their estates. And the capitalist model would eliminate the peasantry. Instead of peasants each farming their own plot of land to farm their own food, they would be reduced to wage laborers, landless, and effectively destitute. Make them work harder because they're desperate every day to find a means to provide for themselves and their families. So they're really going to work hard. That was the theory. And so they imposed on Ireland some requirements to create a poor law, which hadn't really been in existence before, mainly to burden the landlords and force them to get more productive and efficient by adopting a capitalist system. And then when the Irish famine struck, that was due to a potato blight, and potatoes were the main crop that fed a very high percentage of the Irish, especially in the rural areas. People started starving. And welfare policy, famine relief policy was run from the Treasury Department in London. And people in Parliament thought that this was a wonderful opportunity to clear the estates of all those lazy peasants who could simply, before they would be able to plant a quarter acre with potatoes and feed a large family on that tiny little plot. And potatoes pretty much grow with very little tending. So they weren't working as hard, right? And so the conservative work ethic advocates saw the famine as a wonderful opportunity to clear the estates of peasants. Hopefully they'd go elsewhere if they didn't starve. And indeed, millions went to the United States, Canada, Australia, wherever they could manage. Many others died. And this was a path to forcing a capitalist system of agriculture on Ireland. At least that was the thought. And consequently, famine relief, although it was practiced, was extremely stingy. And many devices were invented to reduce the peasants to absolute destitution and to make it almost impossible for them to get aid.
And so, on the other hand, what were the main ideas of people like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and the other Ricardian socialists that can be classified as a progressive work ethic? And what are some of the main ways in which it differs from the conservative version of the work ethic?
Yeah, so just recall that in the late 18th century, the work ethic splits between a pro-worker and a pro-capitalist version.
Right.
Conservatives give us the pro-capitalist version. But then the people I call progressives, because they all believe in progress, and they have a certain view of what it takes to get progress, they're on the pro-worker side. And so that includes Adam Smith, to a certain degree, David Ricardo. He's a somewhat ambiguous figure, but there was a group of so-called Ricardian socialists who took some of Ricardo's ideas to their logical conclusion. John Stuart Mill, and ultimately even Karl Marx are on the pro-worker or progressive side.
Right.
The critical difference that the progressives have with the conservatives is in their attitudes towards poor workers. The conservatives thought poor workers would quit as soon as they got enough to survive. They would quit working. The progressives all thought, look, if you pay them decently, they'll be, and give them a reasonable prospect of improving their lot in life, that will be an incentive for them to work harder. So you have a split between the incentives that we assume the poor have, right? One thinks to make them work hard, they have to be in a situation of poverty and precarity. And the other side says, no, give them realistic prospects for improving their condition, and they will work as hard as you want them to work. But also, there's another fundamental difference in attitude towards the poor. And here, the poor, of course, were the vast majority of workers. So the middle class was still very, very, very tiny.
Yeah.
And that just has to do with whether you trust the poor to use their freedom wisely. So the conservatives were forever wringing their hands over the imprudence they imagined the poor had, that they're having reckless sex and having too many babies and so forth. But for the progressives, how people behave is fundamentally a feature of the incentives that they face. And you could arrange positive incentives in such a way that people will both work hard and be prudent in other ways. They'll save money, they'll practice all of the work ethic virtues if you give them positive opportunities. And so you can trust workers to promote their self-interests and the interests of their families under a properly organized system of social institutions, especially property arrangements.
Mm-hmm. Before we go on, one of the reasons why I was laughing a little bit when you mentioned the ideas that some of the more conservative people had about the poor and the destitute, and particularly them having more children than they should in their mind, of course, is that it sounds really close to some of the ideas that we heard and still hear, unfortunately, from the eugenicists, for example, because I mean, it's always this idea that, oh my God, poor people, the low IQ people, for example, in the 20th century, and now people talk a lot about IQ, for example, low IQ people are having so many children, and it's a disaster and stuff like that. I mean, it's always I laugh because these ideas are not as original as probably many people might think. Right.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when it comes to welfare policy arguments in the United States, and to a great extent also in the UK, conservatives haven't thought a new thought about welfare policy since Malthus. They continue to repeat the same denigrating and suspicious ideas about the poor, regardless of enormous amounts of counter evidence against their assumptions. So now we have literally hundreds of experiments of a basic income where you just hand poor people cash on a monthly basis and see how they do. And overwhelmingly, they're not just lying back and quitting work, but rather they're using that money to improve their condition precisely as Adam Smith thought they would. You know, they're going out there, they're using the money to, get more education, maybe to start a business. Basically, it gives them a longer time horizon with which they can plan, because they don't just have to concentrate exclusively on finding their next meal. And that longer time horizon enables them to plan for bigger things, like investing in their own skills, or just taking on bigger projects than is possible if you're practically on the edge of starvation all the time.
So let me ask you about Marx specifically, because of course he's a huge figure in the 19th century and in economics more largely. So how did these ideas about unalienated work tied to his progressive work ethic?
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite discoveries in reading the text. Marx, of course, was educated at a Christian academy, in Germany as a minor. And in his Abitur, this is his graduation final examination, he was assigned to write on the topic of a young man's choice of vocation. That is, how does a young man decide what his calling will be?
Yeah.
And in his examination essay, he exactly reproduces Robert Sanderson's criteria for finding one's calling. Sanderson was a 17th century Puritan preacher, and he wrote a very famous sermon that was reprinted many, many times, including deep into the 19th century, in which he laid out his criteria, right? And they were, you have to choose something that will positively benefit other people, not just yourself, that you will personally find fulfilling because it exercises skills that you enjoy practicing. And that, conforms, you're able to deploy those skills effectively, right? So you have education in those skills. And essentially in his final exam, Marx reproduces all of those criteria and adds that there's also an expectation of recognition from the recipients of your services, that they'll appreciate what you did, right? That you're showing how you care about their welfare in doing a conscientious job for them. And they reciprocate by honoring what you're doing for them. And that ideal became Marx's ideal of unalienated labor. I mean, step by step, so you can see in a beautiful way how the Puritan notion of the calling leads directly to Marx's ideal of unalienated labor. Really, the Puritans had already figured it out. And then, of course, his critique of capitalism in the 1844 manuscripts is essentially, well, workers aren't getting anything like those conditions, right? They're consigned to drudgery, boring, repetitive tasks that are, mechanized. Yep. They're reduced to drudges. Nobody appreciates what they're doing. They're bored out of their minds. Their work is de-skilled. And I hasten to add that on these points, Marx and Smith were in agreement. Both of them agreed that industrial labor in the factories was horrible for the worker. That is, their daily experience of work was absolutely awful. And both lamented this fact, as did John Stuart Mill. So there, all the progressives are united on their values about what a good job would look like. They all agree, and they're all taking their cues historically. I mean, they're all descended from the Puritan tradition of what a good calling would be like.
And by the way, I guess that it's safe to say that even today, this sort of unalienated work is still true, at least to a great extent, for people who work what we could call essential jobs. There is the jobs that keep society running, and the ideas that people tend to have about those workers, the kind of work they do, and the low status they have in society are still more or less the same, right? And
absolutely.
I'm commenting that just because sometimes we hear people saying that, oh, the bad days of exploitative work in capitalism for people who worked in very bad, extremely bad conditions in factories and elsewhere, they're gone. They occurred in the 19th century. They're not here anymore. But I guess that's not exactly true, right?
It's not true, although it is the case that automation has massively reduced the percentage of workers in the rich countries from being on assembly lines. However, if you look at the global economy, sweatshop manufacturing is all over the world. And those conditions are, not distinguishable from those in the 19th century. They're using higher tech, but it's equally drudgery, it's dangerous, it's dirty, it's unhealthy. Right. It's awful, grueling, and it pays horribly. And it's very unsafe. All the things that Marx complained about, not just in the 1844 manuscripts, but throughout Capital.
So in more recent times, in the 20th century specifically, with the rise of social democracy, in what ways did it encapsulate a progressive work ethic?
Yes, so I read Social Democracy as it was originally imagined by Edward Bernstein, who was an intellectual leader in Germany's Social Democratic Party, as a kind of culmination of the progressive work ethic, because it puts them all together in a package, stressing the importance of decommodifying labor. That is not just reducing workers to whatever they can get in competitive markets controlled by capitalists, enabling people to, get decent wages, safe working conditions. You regulate the factories, but also a rich body of benefits that don't depend on working. So social welfare benefits, paid vacations, access to education that you don't have to pay for out of pocket, medical care, other kinds of social insurance. All of these ideas I think are coming out of the progressive work ethic and going back actually to the Puritan idea that the economy and the division of labor exists to advance everyone's welfare. And it doesn't exist in order to manifest externally some presumed hierarchy of virtue among workers. And it also is based, the social democracy is a very freedom-oriented system. It wants to give people lots of free time so that they can choose to use on their own judgment, rather than working from dawn to dusk at somebody else's direction.
Right. And in what ways does that tie to, historically speaking, the origins of social insurance? And what role does that play in the sort of history that you are exploring in the book?
Yeah, so social insurance is really interesting because it was the idea of social insurance was invented by Condorcet during the French Revolution, and Tom Paine, the great American revolutionary who also played a minor role in the French Revolution. Paine and Condorcet actually knew each other, and Paine traveled to Paris during the revolution and escaped with his head, unlike Condorcet, who was executed by the Jacobins. But these ideas were in the air, and the great contribution that Tom Paine made was to demonstrate its feasibility. That is, what he was postulating was based on British data, treasury receipts, basically, that if you just tax inheritances, you could pay a perfectly fine social insurance package that would include retirement benefits for people too old to work, disability benefits, survivors' benefits for orphans and widows, that it wouldn't take much of a tax on inheritances to give every poor person, adequate insurance against destitution, and that could then replace the poor laws. It would be a universal benefit for everyone, so you wouldn't have to means test benefits, and you would get them on a non-stigmatized basis because everyone would get them. It wasn't a sign of shame or stigma if you received it, since everyone was entitled to this. And he argued on strictly Lockean grounds that the landlords owed a rent to everyone else because once they enclosed the land, they deprived other people of access to it, even though the Lockean assumption, of course, was that the earth started off owned in common by everyone. Right. And so the landlords owed to the rest of society the value of production that could be credited to unimproved land. And that's what the tax would yield. And he proved it was perfectly feasible to abolish poverty by implementing this social insurance system. And also he thought the inheritance tax would be enough to give every young person starting out in life a basic grant, a capital grant, just a lump sum of money which they could use to purchase tools or an education or whatever they need to start off in life at a higher wage, right? So that they wouldn't fall into poverty in the first place.
Right. And so finally getting into the subtitle of your book, what is neoliberalism? What characterizes it exactly? And how was it influenced by the conservative work ethic?
So my argument is that neoliberalism, I'm just defining this as a set of policies, first off, just a set of policies that systematically favor capitalists over workers. And there's a lot of them. That includes low marginal tax rates on supersized income, favorable tax treatment of capital income, the insistence that employers have a monopoly over the direction of their companies with workers not having any voice, a set of global free trade agreements that forbid states from regulating businesses in ways that might reduce their profits. Right? There's a whole set of policies like this that all skew in favor of capital. Oh, and extreme hostility to labor unions, right? Workers shouldn't get a voice. They should just rely on what the market gives them. And hostility, of course, to welfare payments or any access to income other than work for ordinary people. So you put that all together, right? And that's neoliberalism today. And the critical issue is neoliberalism is packaged to contemporary people on the theory that, well, it's about free markets and all the freedom you can have on the market as a consumer or as a worker or as a business owner. But in reality, it's really a theory of shrinking the size of the state and state capacity. Because neoliberalism also thinks, oh, those lazy bureaucrats, they can't do anything efficiently. So government services should be outsourced to private for-profit corporations. Here in the United States, that's been carried to a significant extent. We have private for-profit prisons, just as Bentham advocated. We have private for-profit schools, even in elementary grades. Right, they might be tax funded, but it's really a private entrepreneur who is organizing the school and running it for profit. So that's neoliberalism. And my argument is that neoliberalism just is the latest version of the conservative work ethic. It's like, let the capitalists rule and design property and markets and other institutions in their favor. Hostility to state capacity or any state benefits, because the workers should be in a state of precarity and right under the ideology of personal responsibility and not being dependent. right? That's going back to Priestley. It's all the same. And what I'm doing then is showing that our contemporary neoliberalism is just a rewarmed version of the conservative work ethic, and we should recognize that fact. It's about capitalists ruling.
Yeah, and I guess that people need to stop complaining, because if they are not rich yet, it's just because they're not working hard enough, right?
Right. I mean, that's the theory.
Yeah. And so how does welfare policy operate within neoliberal capitalism?
Yeah, and this is like the great contrast between the social democracies and the model of welfare policy that we see exemplified most strongly in the United States, but to a certain degree in Britain as well, at least under Tory governments.
Yeah.
And the basic idea is you have a general hostility towards universal benefits.
Yeah.
So in the United States, the Democratic Party has been trying since around 1948 to get universal health care. And inch by inch, it's been a massive struggle. We still don't quite have it. Obamacare made a major step towards universal health care, but in fact, there are still many millions of Americans who have inadequate or unaffordable health insurance, or none at all, right? They just can't afford it. And that's right, that you could see that coming out of the hostility to welfare programs that we see in Priestley and Malthus. And so I see the United States as really the conservative work ethic on steroids under neoliberalism. Things have to be means tested. It's very stingy welfare benefits, very mean spirited, lots of arbitrary obstacles in front of getting them, a deep impatience with people who are on benefits for too long, arbitrary cutoff dates. That was the welfare reform that Clinton enacted in 1996. It's all the same.
Mm-hmm. And particularly when it comes to business ethics in neoliberalism, how does a conservative work ethic translate into it exactly? And particularly with this sort of shareholder version of capitalism?
Yeah. So in the immediate post-war era, the United States had a brief era of stakeholder capitalism. And that meant that corporations and the heads of corporations thought that it was their duty to serve all of the stakeholders in the firm. You had high rates of unionization, and so even non-union jobs had to keep up with those wages that were set in the unionized factories.
Yeah.
And CEOs would take pride in the fact that they had so many well-paid workers. But there were other CEOs who opposed that and had a more conservative view of things and thought that, well, a business is not a charity. Businesses should be run strictly for the owners, that is, the shareholders. And our sole duty is to maximize profits. That's what the economist Milton Friedman said. And that theory took off with the rise of neoliberal ideology. Starting in the 1970s, it really took off with the election of Ronald Reagan, who pressed neoliberal policy. And of course, labor unions had been in decline, again, since around 1948, actually, in the post-war era. A major anti-union bill was passed called the Taft-Hartley Bill, which Truman vetoed, but he was overridden. Truman called it a slave labor bill. He thought it would destroy labor unions, and it took some decades. But in fact, labor union rates now in the private sector are around 6%, down from around a third of workers in the private sector at their peak. There's a big difference in bargaining power if you don't have a labor union and if you don't have high labor union density. So workers have been falling back, and capitalists have been massively enlarging their profits. Now, what the Puritans, said is that it's fine to make money, but you're not allowed to make money in predatory and exploitative ways. Yeah. And they listed some of those ways. One of them is they're very stern anti-monopolists. And they didn't care whether the monopoly was established by the state, a state grant of monopoly, or whether it was achieved through various kinds of private sector business tactics. It was wrong. You're not allowed to exploit other people by charging monopoly prices or monopsony prices on labor. That is, if you're the only employer, say in a factory town, you can drive wages down because those workers have no other choice. They didn't like either. And they didn't like, exploiting renters. That was also bad, just hiking the rents because you could. And they also opposed making huge profits based on zero-sum financial speculation. In all the neoliberal economies, we see a financialization happening, where banks are taking a larger and larger share of profits as they are playing more and more purely speculative zero-sum games. We saw what happened with the height of speculation in 2007 and 2008. It basically drove the world economy into recession for years. The Puritans didn't understand macroeconomics, but they did understand that if you just are playing a lot of zero-sum games, you're just profiting at other people's expense. You're not adding value. You're not promoting human welfare. So they were very sternly opposed to making money that way. But that's actually the chief source of profits. If you add up monopoly profits and profits from speculation, that's basically most of the profits that corporations are making now in the global economy. Mm-hmm. So their business models would be condemned by the Puritans, and they're also condemned by social democracy.
So this sort of neoliberal version of the conservative work ethic is the work ethic that is dominant in the world today, right?
I think that's correct, yes. And it's because the global rules of trade have been written in a neoliberal, with a neoliberal orientation. So they prevent countries who have signed on to the World Trade Organization from taking measures that would reduce the profits of foreign investors because of taxation or regulation or minimum wages or any of the other techniques that social democracies use to improve the lot of ordinary workers.
So my final question will be then, what can and should we do about it? Then how can we deal, how can we go or try to go beyond the current state of affairs with neoliberalism and this newer version of the conservative work ethic, and perhaps strive for, try to get into a more progressive version of it?
Well, so I am working from the premise that some idea about the work ethic still has a deep hold, certainly in the United States and the other countries that were originally settled by the English. So that would include Australia, New Zealand, and so forth. That work ethic value still exists. It's in the discourse. And so one of the big contributions of my book is I want to say, look, there really is a positive side to the work ethic, and it makes a certain amount of sense. These are genuine virtues. They're not the only virtues, of course. And one of the chief benefits of social democracy is that It gives us room to develop other values, other virtues besides the work ethic virtues. But it's still the case that social democracy does depend on people working. There's nothing wrong with expecting reciprocity from one another. As the Puritans insisted, that meant that even the rich should be working, and that means positively promoting human welfare and not just collecting income passively or engaging in predatory business methods, but really positively helping other people through disciplined work. Anyone who's able to do that, I think, should be expected to do their share. And the social democracies depend on that, because if people aren't working, you can't raise taxes needed to find a generous welfare state. So you see actually a stress in these countries on high labor force participation and mechanisms such as state-paid preschools to make that possible for women to participate at high rates as well. So what I want to argue is, look, we can't really escape the work ethic, I think. It's deeply embedded in these cultures, but we can turn it around and use it in favor of workers rather than use it against them. And so the chief contribution of my book is to unearth what I call the progressive work ethic, and shows that it animated a large number of thinkers from the 19th century through the glory days of social democracy. I think today that social democracy still remains the most successful model we've ever had of a more equal and fair society, although it's fallen on hard times. And I think what we need to do is re-envision social democracy and reinvigorate it by revising social democratic policies for the 21st century. But again, that does involve acknowledging, some of the values of the work ethic. Of course, we've abandoned for a long time, including the conservatives have abandoned the killjoy aspects that the Puritans had, like no pleasure in this world, right? We've abandoned some of the original values, and rightly so. But others, I think, are worth building on in a way that would actually be helpful to workers.
Great. So the book is again Hijacked: How Neoliberalism Turned the Work Ethic Against Workers and How Workers Can Take It Back. I'm leaving a link to it in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Anderson, apart from the book, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Well, you can go to my website and I have a complete listing of all of my publications. A lot of them online, even if they're under a lot of people have posted, including myself. I do have some things that I'm free to post on academia.edu and ResearchGate. There are some articles you could pick up, or you could request articles from me if they're still under restrictions on wider distribution, and you can write to me privately and I'll send a copy of most anything except for whole books. That I'm not allowed to just send PDFs of whole books around. Those you have to buy.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I'm also adding that to the description of the interview. And thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Oh, it was fun. Thanks for inviting me.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantanti, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pontes Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Zigoren, Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alni Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.